Welcome, everybody. I've been informed that it's time for us to begin, so that's what we'll do. When I was getting ready to come to work today, my 10-year-old son who had the day off said, "Why are you getting ready for work? It's President's Day. No one has to work today." And I thought that that was such a great thing, a great conversation for me to have with him today because, in fact, I feel like on President's Day, it's very fitting that we have one of the nationally renowned experts on presidential rhetoric here as our speaker today. So I have a great feeling that you're not going to feel like you've been at work after you've heard this talk. You're going to feel like it's been a very pleasant and pleasurable experience. Dr. John Murphy is our speaker today. I'm going to tell you a few words about his background before we introduce the subject. Dr. Murphy is an associate professor of the Department of Communication at the University of Illinois. His research concerns the rhetoric on the U.S. presidency with particular respect to contemporary politics, and he is nationally known as an expert in John F. Kennedy, George W. Bush, and William Jefferson Clinton's rhetoric. His work has won multiple research awards, including an award from the National Communication Association, and has appeared in our top journals, including the Quarterly Journal of Speech, Communication Studies, and Rhetoric and Public Affairs, as well as Presidential Studies Quarterly. He is also the recipient, as you'll be able to see shortly, of multiple teaching awards, and he's also widely sought after for his editorial work as well as his guidance with graduate students and undergraduates. He is what we call in academia a triple threat. I would also like to, at this point, acknowledge the fact that his speech is the third in a series that we've had this year as part of the Realities and Representations series, and the subtitle is the 2008 U.S. Presidential Campaign. This series is a joint effort between the Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities and the Communication Studies Department, and on behalf of both those groups, we're very glad to see all of you here today. This series has been designed to investigate the very historic and unusual turn of events we had in the last campaign cycle, and I think you'll find that Professor Murphy's talk today helps us take stock in not only where we've been in the last campaign cycle, but also where we are at the moment with the new president. The title of his talk today is A New Birth of Freedom, Barack Obama and the Rhetorical Uses of History. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you one of my intellectual idols and also one of my best friends, Dr. John Murphy.
Okay, I'm trying to play with technology here, and already it's falling apart. This has gone black. Okay.
Oh, that has gone black.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. No, this worked fine, but that's black.
That's new to me.
Yes, I too know
You
nothing
do tend
of
to fall asleep. Does anybody teach in this room?
Sarah's gone to get
How many PhDs does it take to make something not?
I know, I was thinking maybe.
Just tap
Oh,
it.
there
Okay,
it is.
wake it up. Okay.
We woke it up.
All right.
Sorry, we should be fine
Now
now.
you're good to go. And then when you're done, just whack that.
Okay.
That one.
Okay. I would like to thank those who made this possible, especially Mona Frederick and Polly Case of the Warren Center. They've been wonderful thus far. And my old friends from the Department of Communication, who I've known for a very long time, John Sloop, Vanessa Beasley, and Bonnie Dow, who really did a great deal to make this possible. And I'm very, very happy to be here. They are very good friends. And I want to thank Vanessa for the way too nice introduction. Yeah, we'll see how well that goes. He's so unusual that we understand him through comparison, which tells us both who he is and who he is not. He is and is not George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, John Kennedy, or at least he's supported by John Kennedy, and Ronald Reagan. And for the students who don't recognize that, President Reagan was known as the Teflon president because nothing would ever stick to him at all. And so we can see what they're trying to say about Barack Obama here. Matt Bai wrote of this trend in the New York Times Magazine. Obama is a walking analogy. If he were a punctuation mark, he'd be a colon. If he were a president, he would make our dreams come true. Neither Franklin Pierce nor James Buchanan, neither Warren Harding nor Gerald Ford, neither Richard Nixon nor George W. Bush make the list. Instead, we choose signature presidents as points of comparison for him, as he does. Obama's choice is most often Lincoln. In his announcement address, the tall, gangly, self-made Chicago lawyer spoke of a, quote, tall, gangly, self-made Springfield lawyer, and quoted a great political text to the House Divided oration. In his victory address on the edge of the presidency, Obama turned to another liminal speech, Lincoln's first inaugural. At the inauguration, the president chose a new birth of freedom as his theme and reinforced the allusion by using more language from the Gettysburg Address in his speech. Lincoln is useful to Obama, I think, partly because, like Lincoln, President Obama needs constantly to negotiate his relationship with American history. The Gettysburg Address, in fact, offers a nice clue as to that negotiating strategy. There are three movements in the speech. Lincoln begins with the promise of the founding. Our fathers brought forth on this nation, on this continent, a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He then turns to the crisis, the test of a great civil war. He concludes with redemption. We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The promise of the founding, the test of a civil war, and the redemption of rebirth organize the oration. Note also that the founders make the nation in the opening, the soldiers save the nation in the middle, and we redeem the nation in the conclusion. We act in our turn as the founders and the soldiers acted in theirs. I say we because I mean we. If we return to the opening, this nation is dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Thomas Jefferson's sweeping declaration is Abraham Lincoln's debatable proposition. A proposition is not a fact to be stated, but a claim to be sustained. David Zarefsky writes, "The proof would come over time in the life of the country. To prove the proposition, however, history should be a path of steady progression toward the goal." In Lincoln's view, the founders knew the nation did not begin in the promised land of equality. Rather, we needed to cross the wilderness of slavery before we could get there. But the march, as I suspect Lincoln knew, would not end with emancipation. It would happen again and again over the life of the country, generation after generation of the living, each dedicating itself to the covenant willed to us by the founders, each crossing that wilderness of the Spirit, and each passing over the river to bring forth a union that could be and should be perfected over time. As many of you probably recognize, the last line comes not from the pen of Lincoln, but from that of Barack Obama, from his famed speech of March 18, 2008, commonly known as the race speech. Yet Lincoln and Obama share more than a similar view on the perfectibility of the Union. Rather, they share with many Americans the belief that we are a chosen people, a sacred nation planted on these shores to be a city upon a hill, the last best hope of mankind. There'll be a quiz for all of Dr. Beasley's students afterwards on where city upon a hill came from. And that each generation of Americans must live up to the covenant with God and his founders. The Puritan tradition that undergirds the Gettysburg Address is a powerful strain in American rhetorical history, and the Exodus narrative from which the Puritans drew shapes much discourse in the Western world. John Winthrop, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., and thousands of lesser orators see the Old Testament story of promise, oppression, and redemption as the ideal argument for change. I argue today that Exodus, particularly President Obama's appropriation of the Joshua story, is the core narrative of his public rhetoric. It should come to no surprise that he brings to bear the old-time religion. After all, Exodus offers change many have believed in. Political philosopher Michael Walzer writes that he has found Exodus almost everywhere, often in unexpected places. Literary critic Sackvan Berkovich notes that American Puritans fused secular and sacred history and sought to guide us all collectively toward the American city of God. And rhetorical critic Gary Selby notes that King's first speech during the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, quote, called on the most salient story in the African American tradition, the story of the Exodus, as he prophetically heralded a long-awaited moment, what had happened 4,000 years earlier, when God brought the nation of Israel out of slavery in Egypt, across the Red Sea, through the wilderness and into the promised land of Canaan, was happening in their own day once again. Like Selby, I'm a rhetorical critic. As such, I'm interested in President Obama's advocacy, the way he crafted his life and ideas into a powerful public language. That effort, however personal it seemed, ultimately relied on impersonal, inherited words. James Boyd White notes, the ways we have of claiming, establishing, and modifying meaning are furnished to us by our culture, and we cannot simply remake to suit ourselves the sets of significance that constitute the world. The languages constituting our politics become resources with which a people maintain a collective life, giving meaning and significance to those moments in our continuing community. One task, then, for a rhetorical critic is to examine moments when one language achieves a temporary ascendancy over another. To put it another way, orators begin with instrumental and constitutive purposes. That is, they seek to persuade us to mark slavery as Abraham Lincoln would have it marked for ultimate extinction. More broadly, however, public address shapes us as a people. That is, when we give our assent, we also engage in the identity offered. We think and feel about the Union as Lincoln would have us think and feel. We come to believe in what he called the mystic chords of memory that shape us as a people. Barack Obama wished to become President of the United States, an obviously instrumental goal. Yet his race, in both senses of the term, challenged American identity because he threatened those mystic chords. No black man had ever been president, a position that has historically symbolized the nation. Could Americans see themselves in Barack Obama? I believe the Exodus story offers a way for him to resolve that challenge, both on the level of his role, and on the level of collective identity, the role he would ask us to take as a people. Of course, the two are intimately connected. If we accept the identity of a chosen people, we're more likely to embrace Obama playing the role of Joshua, as I'll argue later on. So to support that claim, I'll first turn briefly to the obstacles facing Obama. Then I'll move to Joshua and the American identity that story implies. Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution of the United States says, "No person except a natural-born citizen or a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall be eligible to the office of President. Neither shall any person be eligible to that office who shall not have attained to the age of 35 years and been 14 years a resident within the United States." That's it, folks. Whew. Anybody who meets that can become president. Now, as you can probably guess, we've added a few unwritten rules along the way. It began at the beginning, of course. What they wanted to write was, no person except George Washington shall be eligible to the office of president. Even after Washington, however, unwritten rules dominated the early republic. To be president, it was best to be a white, male, property-laden Virginian of the Revolutionary War generation who had once served as Secretary of State. 4 of the first 6 presidents were Secretaries of State. 4 were Virginians. The other 2 were a father-son pair, John and John Quincy Adams, whose handsome picture lines the walls in the office of the Department of Communication. This was a small world. Andrew Jackson broke it open and then closed it. He rose from the great mass of poor Scots-Irish and lifted them to power through a virulent racism, condemning slaves, Indians, and the rest. Jackson, mind you, represents the only significant expansion in the pool of possible presidents until John Kennedy, Irish Catholic. And lest we congratulate ourselves too much for our current tolerance, recall that JFK is not just the first, but the only Catholic president in the history of the country. In light of this history, Barack Hussein Obama faced some difficulties. He was 47 years old, and only 3 of our 44 presidents have ever been younger: Teddy Roosevelt, John Kennedy, and Bill Clinton. He was a senator. Nearly 50 years ago, Kennedy became the first senator in better than a century, do the math, to be elected to the presidency directly from that body, and no one but Obama has managed to do so since. Obama served in that fine, upright, full of integrity legislative body known as the Illinois State Senate from 1997 to 2004, and in the U.S. Senate from 2004 to 2008, a total of about 10 years of public service, 2 of which he spent running for the presidency. Arguably, you have to return to Chester A. Arthur to find a president with less experience, and he only became president because someone shot James Garfield. Before that, there's Lincoln, the least qualified man by traditional criteria ever to hold the office. And, of course, Obama is African American. Despite our recent celebrations of this fact, we failed, I think, to grasp its true significance because we white people never want to read what we once said about African Americans. There's a reason why great speech collections fail to include the finer utterances of Thomas Jefferson, John C. Calhoun, Woodrow Wilson, Strom Thurmond, George Wallace, or Richard Russell. White Americans spent 300 years defining African Americans as something less than human, and the last 40 years acknowledging that African Americans may indeed be people. For instance, Abraham Lincoln said during the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say that, in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the 2 races living together on terms of perfect equality." Lest you think I'm being too historical, recall this gem from Senator Obama's victory speech. This election had many firsts and many stories, but one that's on my mind tonight's about a woman who cast her ballot in Atlanta. She's a lot like millions of others who stood in line to make their voices heard in this election, except for one thing. Ann Nixon Cooper is 106 years old. She was born just a generation past slavery, when someone like her couldn't vote for 2 reasons: because she was a woman and because of the color of her skin. An Obama voter lived during the Roosevelt administration, Teddy Roosevelt's administration. She was alive when the Chicago Cubs last won a World Series. This is a young nation. It wasn't that long ago when we treated African Americans not only as second-class citizens, but also as second-class people. That's a tough obstacle for an African American who wants to be president. There is a long and powerful tradition of national rhetoric that defines him as not quite fully American, not quite fully human. Beyond that, Obama also faced the difficulty encountered by candidates from minorities. On the one hand, practically, you've got to reach out past your given constituency because there aren't enough votes in the minority to win. On the other hand, your efforts to reach out can be taken as selling out. Thus, at various times, Obama confronted charges that he was too black or not black enough. His primary opponent, in both senses of that term, Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton, once he beat Hillary, he was going to win, compounded the problem. Her husband was often acclaimed as the first black president, and both possessed deep ties to the African American community. Congressman John Lewis, for instance, the famous former civil rights activist, initially endorsed Clinton. Senator Obama needed a language that would shape his candidacy as plausible, even perfectible, one that represented the nation's best interests. The Exodus narrative offered one way. The Exodus story proper consumes 5 books of the Old Testament: Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua. Much space is devoted to the various laws that hold the nation of Israel in covenant with the Lord, but the basic narrative goes like this. A corrupt Egypt keeps the people of Israel in captivity. The Lord remembers his people, hears their lamentations, and appoints Moses, or Charlton Heston, to lead them out of slavery. When Pharaoh, i.e. Yul Brynner, refuses to let my people go, God sends awful plagues down upon him and ultimately parts the Red Sea so that Moses can lead the people out of Egypt. Once in the wilderness, the Israelites have many crises of faith, signified by murmurings of discontent and worship of idols. There is a great deal of murmuring in Numbers. Each time they break the covenant, they subsequently rededicate themselves to it, but they prove such a mess that God decrees no one of that generation, including Moses, shall get to the promised land. Instead, they wander the wilderness for 40 years until that generation dies. The Lord does take Moses up to the mountaintop to show him Canaan, but Joshua is appointed to lead the people into the land of milk and honey. The book of Joshua then explodes with destruction and death and smiting and putting to the sword and as a bloody-minded kid, I love the book of Joshua. I always volunteered for this in Sunday school because Joshua is, whoa, Battle of Jericho, whole 9 yards. This narrative performs several rhetorical tasks critical to agitation. It explains oppression in terms that create an innocent people. It's not your fault that you suffer, but that of the Egyptians. It will be your fault, however, if you falter on the way to freedom. That's another point. It encourages you to keep the faith. The Lord will keep his covenant with you, and you should return the favor. If that is the case, however, a question occurs to the skeptical. Why do we suffer if we are chosen? American Puritans believed the best answer to that question was that of a parent, broccoli, and kids. It's good for you. Berkovich writes, in their case, they believed God's punishments were corrective, not destructive, sort of like the tenure process. Here, New England, as nowhere else, his vengeance was a sign of love, a father's rod used to improve the errant child. In short, their punishments fulfilled their promise. The phrase, as nowhere else, is also crucial. Chosen people are, well, chosen. Although this may seem exclusionary, we tend to shrink from that today. You're chosen. Imagine yourself, a mid-20th century African American. You're facing fire hose, club, dog, or you're a Puritan on the edge of a continent, savage enemies to your front and a vengeful king to your back. The narrative lifts you up. It assures you of victory. It amplifies your people. You become a city upon a hill, not some weird religious commune called Boston. As Jonathan Ryder notes in a study of Martin Luther King's language, he was almost always at work, elevating the people, poeticizing their pain and struggle. Finally, as Ryder hints, it identifies two common archetypes of leadership. The poetic Moses lifts us up, parts the sea, restores our faith. The prosaic Joshua organizes us for battle, brings us across the river, and leads us home. The prophet and the politician. Barack Obama knows his Bible, and never did he demonstrate that more clearly on March 4, 2007. Liberal America, black and white, had come to Selma, Alabama, to commemorate the 42nd anniversary of Bloody Sunday. In March 1965, as Dr. Beasley's students know, activists sought to march from Selma to Montgomery to protest the inability of black citizens to register and vote in Alabama and throughout the South. Alabama state troopers met the marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma and brutally beat them. John Lewis, for instance, suffered a cracked skull. President Lyndon Johnson then addressed a joint session of Congress calling for a Voting Rights Act and famously borrowing the civil rights slogan, "We shall overcome." The legislation passed that year. Yet this was more than a ceremonial or epideictic occasion. That'll be on the test too, epideictic rhetoric. The Clintons had to come to town as well, and this visit to Selma, the New York Times noted on March 4, became a proxy battle for black support between Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Obama, whose candidacy represents a threat to Mrs. Clinton's traditional base. Senator Obama needed to make the case that the African American community should abandon the Clintons and embrace his insurgency. Of course, this would not happen in a single speech. It did not happen fully until the South Carolina primary the following year. but Obama needed to make the move plausible. He begins, as politicians do, by thanking those who made his appearance possible. Amidst the thanks, Obama's attitude emerges, particularly in the tone he crafts toward the past generation. He is deeply respectful. To John Lewis, somebody who I have admired all my life, and were it not for him, I'm not sure I'd be here today, he offers thanks. To Joseph Lowry, I'm not sure I'm going to thank Reverend Lowry because he stole the show, something Obama might have remembered for his inaugural. To C.T. Vivian, when you have to speak in front of somebody who Martin Luther King said was the greatest preacher he ever heard, then you got some problems. And I'm a little nervous about following so many great preachers. And the audience calls out, "Preach, son, preach." The response is crucial. Obama soon becomes a kind of son. He turns then to his announcement address, saying that he gave it near the old Illinois state capitol, where Abraham Lincoln delivered his speech declaring, drawing from Scripture, that a house divided against itself could not stand. The choice of quotations seems small, but looms large. Lincoln gave the House divided speech in 1858, accepting the Republican nomination for the Senate to run against Stephen Douglas. The Republicans were a brand new political party. They first ran a presidential candidate 2 years earlier. Douglas was a prominent national figure. Political identities were in flux. Some Republicans thought they should support the Democrat, not Lincoln. Support the safe choice for Senate. You know, the guy had cut him a deal. After all, in Illinois, a Senate seat is a bleeping valuable thing. Why take a chance on a gangly self-made lawyer when you could lose it all by not supporting the big guy? Illinois politics has not changed much at all. Lincoln's speech then was a call for national unity and party unity, but one based on principle, a claim made by a new leader in a new time in opposition to the insiders. Obama knows there's a certain audacity, a certain presumptuousness, as he says, about this sort of claim and campaign. As the Lincoln quotation reveals, the senator wishes to unify the African American community, the party, even the nation, around the candidacy of this young man. Presumption indeed. A friend wrote to offer help against such charges. I got a letter from Pastor Moss giving me encouragement and saying how proud he was that I had announced and encouraging me to stay true to my ideals and my values and not to be fearful. And he said if there's some folks out there who are questioning whether or not you should run, just tell them to look at the story of Joshua, because you're part of the Joshua generation. A type is emerging. Joshua, Lincoln, Obama, men bringing new ideals and practical action to a suffering nation. I mean type in a specific way. Typology, the Oxford Companion to the Bible says, is an interpretive practice whereby a person or series of events occurring in the Old Testament is interpreted as a type or foreshadowing of some person, almost invariably Christ, or some figure in the Christian dispensation. Particularly in the black church, the New Testament person or type is the antitype. So, for instance, you have the parting of the Red Sea becoming a type. For baptism, immersion in the water is the antitype. For American Puritans and African Americans, the children of Israel are the type to which they are the antitypes. Scriptural life has not ended. Richard Lisher explains, the cruelties of slavery made it imperative that African Americans not step back, but step into the book and its storied world of God's personal relations with those in trouble. The enslaved African Americans listened to the Bible and adopted a new history. Their leaders were Moses, Joshua, Samson, and Jesus. Their only hope was to recognize their own suffering and captivity in the Bible stories. Better yet, here's Barack Obama in Dreams from My Father. And in that single note, hope, I heard something else. At the foot of that cross, inside the thousands of churches across the city, I imagine the stories of ordinary black people merging with the stories of David and Goliath, Moses and the Pharaoh, the Christians in the lion's den, Ezekiel's field of dry bones. Those stories of survival and freedom and hope became our story, my story. The blood that had spilled was our blood, the tears our tears, until this black church on this bright day seemed once more a vessel carrying a story of a people into future generations and into a larger world. Our trials and tribulations became at once unique and universal, black and more than black. It's nice when your topic confirms your critical approach. For the African American community, of course, the role of Moses is, shall we say, filled. King asserted that place most chillingly in his last speech, telling his people that it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. You may not get there with them, King acknowledged, but we as a people will get to the promised land. King's haunting embodiment of Moses often causes us to overlook the other rhetorical move, the we that constituted a people, King's people, God's people, the ones who will get to the promised land, as Ryder notes, if not in the generation of Moses, then in the one of Joshua. But, Obama says at Selma, there is not just one Moses. We are in the presence today of a lot of Moseses. We're in the presence today of giants whose shoulders we stand on, people who battled not just on behalf of African Americans, but on behalf of all of America, that battled for America's soul, that shed blood, that endured taunts and torment, and in some cases gave the last full measure of devotion. Consistent with Puritans and with Lincoln and other 19th century orators, Obama amplifies the Moseses into giants. Their accomplishments are many. His description resembles the crucifixion, the taunts, the blood, and invokes Gettysburg, the last full measure of devotion. Moses to Jesus, to Lincoln, to King, each foreshadowing and fulfilling the other unto the present. Equally important, each is unique and universal, battling for his people and on behalf of all of America. Now, of course, we cannot possibly measure up to them. And that's the paradoxical point of the argument. On the one hand, the comparison itself, the filial piety, if you will, generates the anxiety necessary to try. We are not them, but the example demands that we try to emulate them. And I'm sure Vanderbilt students don't know anything about performance anxiety. Nobody ever demands of you that you should do well. And that's sort of the issue that's involved here. On the other hand, we are reassured, unlike Vanderbilt students, that we are people of the covenant, a covenant made manifest in the deeds of those civil rights activists. And because of them, we don't have to do as much. And so because of what they endured, because they marched, they led a people out of bondage. They took them across a sea that folks said could not be parted. They wandered through a desert, but always knowing that God was with them, and that if they maintained that trust in God, they would be all right. And it's because they marched that the next generation hasn't been bloodied so much. I quote in full so that you know Obama invokes the story in full, the whole story. But note that his narrative stops in the desert, and with that next, not-so-bloody generation poised on the brink. After a long, fascinating personal narrative meant to qualify him as one of them, Obama says again, I stand on the shoulders of giants. I thank the Moses generation, but we've got to remember now that Joshua still had a job to do. As great as Moses was, there are still battles that need to be fought, some rivers that need to be crossed. Obama continues to laud the Moses generation, but the speech shifts tone as the senator turns to the question, I guess, that I have today is what's called of us in the Joshua generation? What do we do in order to fulfill that legacy, to fulfill the obligations and the debt that we owe to those who allowed us to be here? The rest of the speech answers that question, but the answer, while intriguing, is less important than the performance. By explaining Joshua's task, Obama becomes Joshua. Yet the performance has to ring true. He cannot be Joshua unless he can sound Joshua. He does. In the excerpts I've given, Obama displays his biblical knowledge and his command of the Exodus narrative. He says, for instance, we reject the notion that we can't aspire to the highest of heights, that our talents can't be expressed to their fullest. The line is nice, but there's more here than meets the ear. Archetypal metaphors, those cross-cultural comparisons, like high-low, characterize King's rhetoric. For those of you who've read I Have a Dream, you see the high-low metaphors running throughout it. Similarly, the phrase recalls King's 3 dimensions of a complete life, with all of its spatial imagery. Similarly, when Obama turns to his generation's tasks, he worries that it thinks the very height of ambition, there it is again, is to make as much money as you can, to drive the biggest car and have the biggest house and wear a Rolex watch. This is, 2007. And get your own private jet, get you some of that Oprah money. But, he says, materialism alone will not satisfy the possibilities of your existence. You have to fill that with something else. In Paul's letter to American Christians, King, as Paul writes, I have heard of your dashing subways and flashing airways. Through your scientific genius, you have been able to dwarf distance and place time in chains. But, America, I wonder whether your moral and spiritual progress has been commensurate with your scientific progress. In the pairs I've discussed, Moses is to Joshua as Jesus is to Paul, the prophet and the politician. Senator Obama knows his role and plays it well. It offers powerful advantages to him. For one thing, the role of Joshua is, in a broad sense, that of a good son. My 82-year-old rock-ribbed Republican mother loves Barack Obama. He is such a good son. At Selma, for instance, Obama speaks of the degree of discipline and fortitude of civil rights activists. Young people, back straight, eyes clear, suit and tie. Seen a picture of our president lately? Yeah, back straight, suit, tie. If you haven't, just, I'm sort of dressed. I'm my own visual aid today. This is Obama. Black suit, white shirt, colored tie. That's every occasion. In addition, the idea of filial piety gives Obama resources for reflection, or to put it nicely, or more harshly, criticism of the African American community. So at Selma, in Atlanta for the 2008 King Day celebration, and at Chicago's Apostolic Church of God for Father's Day 2008, he made pointed remarks, stuff tough enough that Jesse Jackson wanted to cut off his... Well, you can Google what Jesse Jackson wanted to cut off. As you can already imagine, Obama presents his case as one of decline, however. We're not living up to the Moses generation. In essence, he's saying we're not living up to Jesse Jackson. So it's really hard for Jesse Jackson to critique him when Jesse Jackson is the object of veneration. But at the same time, the narrative gives Obama room to dissociate himself as well, to create some distance. So, when he addresses the Reverend Jeremiah Wright in Broglio on March 18, 2008, Obama implicitly invokes the distinction between the Moses and the Joshua generations. He uses them to redefine his relationship with his minister. At one point, the senator enumerates the travails African Americans faced in the mid-20th century United States and says, this is the reality in which Reverend Wright and other African Americans of his generation grew up. For men and women of Reverend Wright's generation, the memories of humiliation and doubt and fear have not gone away, nor has the anger and bitterness of those years. The Moses generation did not cross into the promised land because they sinned. It is a hard thing to say aloud. Obama does not do so. But for a churched community, one that, in the meme of the moment, he would not throw under a bus, Obama needs a narrative that embraces and distances the Reverend Wright, as well as all those, black and white, who lived through those times. It is time, Obama argues, to put an end to the 60s. Michael Walzer writes that the Israelites spent 40 years in the wilderness for a reason. They needed to make themselves anew, to become one, to endure a school of the soul. Critically, it is the act of the covenant that finally makes of them a people. Previously, he says, they shared only the experience of oppression. Their identity, he argues, was something that happened to them. Only with the covenant do they make themselves into a people in the strong sense, capable of sustaining a moral and political history of marching forward and sliding back. Only by the Joshua generation, Obama implies, do we make a history. That is his task. Reverend Wright cannot do what needs to be done because he believes, in Obama's words, that we are still irrevocably bound to a tragic past. He believes, in other words, that we're still in Egypt. In contrast, Obama asserts, but what we know, what we have seen, is that America can change. That is the true genius of this nation. What we have already achieved gives us hope, the audacity to hope, for what we can and must achieve tomorrow. The Joshua generation can pass over the river precisely because it is not as bloodied, because it is not the Moses generation. America succeeds when its people sustain its true genius, its comic, not tragic, a comic covenant of hope. For Obama, history proves this to be true. In his rhetoric, he grasps one final advantage of the narrative. He recycles time not only when he defines himself, but also the American people. Each generation foreshadows the next, and subsequent generations fulfill the promise of previous ones. As typology suggests, we all become one. A strong American identity emerges. For instance, most famous example, remember the powerful conclusion to his New Hampshire primary speech that became the video, the famed "Yes, We Can" sequence. It was a creed written into the founding documents that declared a destiny of a nation, Obama calls. Echoing King's most famous speech, "I have a dream that one day this nation will live out the true meaning of its creed," and equating secular documents to religious statements of belief, creeds. Yes, we can, he continues, in parallel structure, a form that inevitably recalls King in our rhetorical culture. Obama calls forth slaves and abolitionists, immigrants and pioneers, workers who organized, women who reached for the ballot, a president who chose the moon as our new frontier, and a king who took us to the mountaintop and pointed the way to the promised land. Each generation iterates and reiterates those before and after, binding the nation together in an endless, incomplete loop, yet always somehow successful loop, making of us a more perfect union. Not coincidentally, Obama always ends his historical sequencing of generations with the civil rights movement, with the prophet pointing the way. History stopped in Memphis in 1968, and U2 sang about it. That's what we left with. Now that's rhetorically powerful and weirdly problematic. As a rhetorical critic, I cannot help but admire Barack Obama's achievement. We've grown blasé about it, which says something in and of itself. We elected an African-American president in November of 2008. President Obama has made that seem like a normal part of our evolution as a nation. No big thing, slave, president, woohoo. The Exodus story, I suspect, had something to do with that because it's such a great crossover hit. That is, it invokes the African-American cultural experience. It helped to unite the African-American community around him as his base, but at the same time, it echoes in American history because we believe in American exceptionalism. This kind of narrative is carved deep into the foundation stone of our national rhetoric. Our faith makes him possible. His acts validate our faith. It is a relationship that harkens back to the Puritans, which in turn is the problem. As I close, here are a couple of things I'm mulling. Over the centuries, the Exodus narrative has justified revolution and freed peoples. It's a part of our national identity and establishes Americans as chosen of God. Is that what our world and times require of us today, even given Exodus's revolutionary heritage? Second, if you've read Joshua, you'll know there are reasons to get nervous about this role. Yes, he completes Moses' mission, a work of imperialism by some interpretations. Joshua is a deeply ambiguous, violent role. There's a reason it's a computer named Joshua who nearly nukes the world in the 1983 classic War Games. Claire is just loving that one, yeah. For President Obama, however, The journey, as he repeatedly refers to it, especially in his inaugural, we're always on a journey, we're always on a march. Look at the inaugural. Journeys and marches are everywhere in that speech. The journey has just begun. Journeys, as the Samaritan and the Levite on that road knew, change us in ways we cannot predict. Moses, Joshua, and Martin Luther King Jr. also knew and understood the power of the road. As we struggle with our difficulties today, we should remember what King said when those marchers finally made it across the Edmund Pettus Bridge all the way to Montgomery. The road ahead is not altogether a smooth one. There are no broad highways that lead us easily and inevitably to quick solutions, but we must keep going. Thank you very much. I realize I've soaked up a bunch of your time on a Monday afternoon, and you're probably thinking, oh my God, but I'm perfectly willing to spend at least a couple of minutes answering questions if you have them. Yes?
You mentioned him several times who Obama compared to who he's like, Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt, and this formulation you have of this was the founding mission of the nation, here is the crisis, we're moving towards the redemption. Seems something that comes up not just in those three, but even in Pierce, Buchanan, and any number of presidents who he wouldn't want to be compared to. So could you say anything about who is he not? If his rhetorical tradition is echoing some of those you said he is like, or specifically Lincoln, who is he not? What's the counter tradition that he's?
He's not Bush. That is, there's a real sense in which most American presidents try to invoke this at one time or another. But part of what our historical judgment becomes is who fails the task of redemption, who does not redeem us as a people, who morally compromises who we are as a people. Part of the reason, for instance, that we always lump Pierce and Buchanan together is the Kansas-Nebraska Act and what went on at that point in time in the Dred Scott decision. Because these are things that we regard as morally compromising, that these are the things that officially declared African Americans are not fully people. Certainly in the Dred Scott decision, neither citizens nor people. So yeah, what he's trying to differentiate from, and with Bush, I meant in all seriousness, because my suspicion is that a century from now, we will remember that administration for torture. An administration that embraced the notion that we should torture our enemies, not just did it secretly, but openly announced it was doing it. And we will regard that as demeaning to our national character, that is something that should not have been done. So that's the distinction I think he was trying to draw.
But then essentially the distinction is results rather than rhetoric. I mean, they're all reaching for the same. Or is there a rhetorical model that he is contrasting himself with?
That's an interesting question. I think a rhetorical model, there are two presidents who, in both good ones, granted, do not invoke this narrative all that often. One, I think, is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is quite pragmatic. The times he invokes the Bible, he's certainly distancing, but he's distancing, I've been longing for FDR lately. I've been longing for Obama to say things like, I want to drive the money changers from the temple. I think that's a good story. I think we should spend more time with that part of the Bible right now. But you don't often see this sort of that kind of narrative. At least I don't. Dr. Finnegan may be more familiar with that and be able to say you're wrong. The other one is John Kennedy, who is our least civil religious president, I think, in the history of this country, who seldom invokes that narrative, and who is very careful, in fact, to question American exceptionalism. And so in one of his most famous speeches, in the American University speech, when he is calling for negotiations with the Soviet Union for a nuclear test ban treaty, he essentially says, look, nuclear weapons make us all equal. There are no exceptional people when the bomb goes off. That's it. We aren't exceptional. The famous line where it says we all breathe the same air. We all share this small planet. That's a different move. So yeah, that would be my one response. Oh, and one other contrast, real quick. I'm sorry. We've often, Reagan was famous for this narrative. But what's interesting about Reagan is that he always situated it in the past. And we were always trying to recover a past that we had lost. Obama's always pointing us towards the future. The cycle, as he presents it, is endless in the sense that we're never quite done. Reagan presents us as done, but then we screwed up and fell away from it. Obama says we're never done. There's always somebody else we need to extend freedom to. And so his narrative really is a twist on the conservative narrative tends to be we need to regain the values of the past because we've lost them. Obama's narrative is not that we have lost them, but that they need to get extended. And that's been always part of our job, and it's been part of our job from day one. So that's the other context. Sure?
I have an odd question. I love this juxtaposition of the poetic Moses and the prosaic Joshua. And this keyed in my mind thinking a little bit about how during the campaign Obama was frequently criticized for being too eloquent, something that Christians cringe when we hear, right? Like, what's wrong with eloquence? But I wonder if you might talk a little bit about Obama's eloquence, maybe through that frame of Joshua or Moses, because it would seem to me that if Joshua's more prosaic and he's the politician, then he's actually not that kind of prophetic figure that people were claiming Obama was past himself. But there's still an art to what Joshua's doing.
Yeah, and I got to say, that's where I kind of have a safety hiding hole here. Part of that is that Joshua was also a repetition of Moses and receives, in the opening of the book of Joshua, receives the commission from Moses. And so certainly there's eloquence to what Joshua does. Now I think it's a different kind of eloquence. I mean, there's a reason I think the best Saturday Night Live sketch on Obama is the cool sketch. Have you seen it? Where he's so cool. And they do the early 60s pastel color behind him with a little light jazz going on. And Obama's like, I'm cool. And the economy collapses, but you don't see me sweat. I'm cool. That's the sort of feeling that he is cool. And I think it's also telling that he dialed the stuff back. And he has dialed what he does back a little bit. That's why, John Sloop was deeply dissatisfied with the inaugural, because Obama really dialed it back and got real prosaic and practical on Sloop. And this was not what he was looking for at that moment. And so there are those kinds of reactions to it as well. But I do think Joshua can be eloquent. But one other small thing I didn't have time to include that's really kind of cool. This is the part I love. In both Numbers and in Joshua, all these key moments before they cross anything, Moses or Joshua call the people together, they read the law out loud, they all take a deep breath, and then they cross the River Jordan or they cross the Red Sea or do anything. So what does Obama end his inaugural doing? He portrays Washington calling everybody together and reading Thomas Paine's pamphlet, The Crisis, to all the soldiers before they crossed the Delaware and attacked Trenton on Christmas Eve. It was the symbolic reenactment of the whole covenant story all over again. And you could just see him doing this again and again and again in his discourse. Once you start getting keyed in the journey metaphors, the water metaphors, there's all this water imagery at the beginning of the inaugural. What the? This is a little overdone. There are raging seas and stuff. And that starts to kick into the Moses narrative.
It only includes weather metaphors. Because at the end he does that winter of our whatever thing. So it's broader than just water.
Yeah, but there's still water.
My question is that you said that Obama makes it seem like it's normal for us to have now elected a black president by using the Exodus narrative, but I feel like America is so much younger and shorter a story than the Egyptians. This took so long. So there's still a question of how could we have made this switch in such a short amount of time, relatively speaking.
Correct me if I'm wrong. So when you say short
I think
attention,
that he would have to use other rhetorics to support this feeling because America's story is so much smaller than the Exodus narrative, which is dragged out over such a long period of time for them to make the transition.
Yeah, I think one thing I would say is that even though the Exodus narrative has lived forever, one of the reasons it has is because it's such a cool, short, quick, promise, test, redemption. Heck, this is in your personal life. Look at any self-help book on a shelf. They're going to say, you are a wonderful person. But there will be times in your life where people will say, why do bad things happen to good people? I mean, the self-help books pick up the structure. The Exodus narrative structure is embedded, I swear, if there is such a thing as some gigantic unconscious. So it's very familiar to us. But the second part is, you're right, obviously, I say it's the core, I think it's a backbone, I think it's a core. Does he do lots of other stuff too? Absolutely. I mean, Obama's skilled in a variety of other kinds of ways. And so he finds ways to supplement that narrative. He finds other strategies that are complementary to it, that work with it. And I think that becomes part of what goes on too. And the way in which he eases us through that. But some of them have roots. Even some of those have roots in the Exodus narrative. So there was a very powerful generational argument in that campaign. And part of it was, you can sort of demonstrate that you were not bigoted, and that you were dumb, and that you were excited, and that you were cool, by voting for Obama. And to vote for him. Is that cool? No. These people can't even use Twitter. Go on. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
You've kind of touched on this before, but can you talk about the candidate Obama and the rhetoric that was somewhat soaring and inspirational versus what we might expect as President Obama and what the changes might be?
I'm under the growing suspicion that this guy's really good. Big surprise. I'm not sure so much that it's the difference between candidate and president as it is rhetorical task. So early in the primary season, he was second to Senator Clinton. He was widely perceived as way behind second to Senator Clinton. That he'd blown the first part of his campaign. What was he up to? Remember all the Clinton machine, grind him up. All that stuff was going to happen. And once he won the Iowa caucuses, part of what he wanted to do then was to rush you to the exits. He was going to get you to some huge rallies, big stadiums, yes we can, pound you through to the exits, seal the deal. And just couldn't quite seal it the way he wanted. But that was the height, February, March, when he was winning 11 in a row. That was the height of the sort of Obama, yes we can, here we go thing. If you take my perspective that this is a strategy, that he's not just changing my role, well, what happens the next time he needs to sort of seal a deal? I think he knew he could do the stimulus package in Washington and through Washington, which is what he basically did. Healthcare, for instance, I think is going to take a lot more. It's going to take a lot of pressure from outside groups. And I wouldn't be as surprised at all to see us go back to Springsteen and the E Street Band on a stadium tour with 80,000 people in a congressional district in Maine, so that the two women senators in Maine will do the right thing, and they'll see 100,000 Mainers and New Hampshireites showing up to cheer President Obama's health care plan. And when you see 100,000 of them, I don't think there is a stadium with 100,000 people. I don't think you can hold 100,000 people anywhere in Maine. But you get my drift, that there will be moments, I think, where he will move back to that strategy, because it is a strategy. It's not like this role that he did or doesn't do or anything. He tries to accomplish goals with his rhetoric. And so in this instance, I think he's toned things down because he wants to accomplish a different sort of goal. He wants to work within Washington.
In the 1960s with MLK being Moses, and there are certain conditions, I think also in the 1960s, that led to the height of the civil rights movement. And I think in the Bible, like, there were circumstances in Egypt that led to Moses, like, leading the people out of Egypt. Do you see other circumstances currently today that that would indicate, like, Obama being Joshua and
You tend to see this kind of rhetoric most often in two circumstances. One is when something bad, really, really bad happens. We tend to go to the Bible. So even though I say FDR wasn't like this, when the Great Depression happens, we're with the money changers in the temple. In 1968, when everything is going wrong, everything, king is killed, cities are burning, riots everywhere, Robert F. Kennedy was using this kind of moral interpretive frame to try to see, say what's going on. So we tend to see it in times are bad. Times are not good now. Now, they're not as bad as that, and we don't see it as much. What's going to be interesting, I think, over the next couple of months is when we really start to see it, when this stuff really starts to sink in. So that's one circumstance. So when times are really bad, that's when we tend to sort of notice this stuff more clearly and fully. The other thing that I sometimes wonder about with this is that, up through really about the 1960s, this was a biblically literate nation. And so, for instance, one of the most hilarious debates you can read is in the middle of FDR's New Deal, when they were arguing whether Roosevelt had departed from the orthodoxy of the Democratic Party. And there were all these people giving these big public speeches and arguing, and they were all organized around the biblical story of Jacob and Esau. And they were accusing each other of, Jacob, you left Esau's house. And you read these today and you went, let me get this straight. Your attack ads were that you were Esau? That's the attack ad you're writing? We're not as biblically literate today. Even the students I taught at Georgia who claimed to be born again, didn't necessarily know their... So I had to explain the Exodus story to them because, it wasn't totally clear to them. Not completely clear. So, there becomes cultural narratives that you've got to sort of learn and pick up as well, too. And that can become hard.
Well, this sort of speaks to your point about how that narrative gets, translated into a sort of self-help vocabulary, right?
And
it
good
gets,
son vocabulary.
Right, it gets
too.
embedded in all these different ways so that you don't even necessarily, for it to work for you, you don't necessarily have to be able to trace it back to the Bible, right? But you recognize the structure because the structure is so pervasive.
Yeah, and certainly, as I said, my parents just, and realized my mother's a person who voted for Harry Truman because her mother-in-law told her to when she drove her to the polls in 1948. And she voted for Lyndon Johnson in 1964 because he said he wouldn't send my brother to fight the Vietnam War, and then the little, blah, 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 tried to. And those are it. That's the two Republicans, or two Democrats. That's it. And so for her to suddenly decide that Barack Obama, is just the greatest thing since sliced white bread and barbecue is really amazing. And there's a good son aspect to that. There really is. He performed, and that's a kind of offshoot of the role of Joshua, that you do the right thing by the values of the previous generation. And in a sense, I say good son, but in a sense I think it's almost a grandson narrative. Because the immediate sons, Sharpton, Jackson, a little controversial, a little bit iffy, but then here comes Obama. Yeah, okay. It's the way we feel about current candidates. We kind of go, ugh. But, maybe somewhere down the road there'll be another candidate that, looks, is not doing heroin. No, looks like a regular candidate.
You were just talking about how we're not as biblically literate as we used to be, and especially the younger generation. So how do you think Obama could pull these biblical references into so many of his speeches so powerfully and still draw in that young generation? How did he maneuver that?
Part of it, I think, is because, especially when you use the rhythms of the King James Bible, not necessarily the exact language, but the rhythms of it, this is just good language. There's a reason why we read the King James Bible for centuries. There's a reason why we hear vaguely this phrase to do justice and to walk humbly with Micah. And we might not be able to get Micah. One of the funny things about teaching these speeches is my students can always identify that it came from the Bible. They may not know where from the Bible, or they may not know, oh, that's from the Bible. Now, every once in a while they're wrong, it ends up being, I don't know, war games. But, that's, most times they get something that's from the Bible and has this kind of aura to it, but it's just well-written words. You get caught up in it. We sometimes underestimate what something well-written does. He gets you in that rhythm. And part of it is one small thing, is prose rhythm. Rhythm's hard to get out of. It's why, what's the thing I'm always giving you that you hate?
Earworms.
Earworms. And so I'll say, you'll hear a bit of a song and you can't get it out of the head for the rest of the day. And you just want to blow your brains out in order to get that song out of your head. Or that advertisement, or that line. If I had heard throw under the bus one more time, during the Reverend Wright thing, I was going to blow my brains out. I was so tired of that phrase. And rhythm is like that in prose, and so when you get, I have a dream, or you get, yes we can. And Obama's so good with rhythm. If you, I know, gosh, Dr. Dow, I know, just came to love that lovely Yes I Am, Yes I Can video with Will I Am and Scarlett Johansson and the rest. But if you listen to that, you realize they didn't edit him. They did not edit him. They didn't slow him down or speed him up. His speech is such that you can make a song out of it without changing it. You couldn't do that with W. So that, and once you get into rhythm, it's hard to get out of it. You go with somebody, you get more and more excited about it, you build it up. There's a reason you play certain songs right before a basketball game and everybody starts bouncing up and down. All that stuff starts to happen with rhythm. And that's part of it. Lots of ways about it. That's part of it.
We have a terrific opportunity to continue the conversation outside via some reception, so we hope you'll all join us there. And for now, please join me in thanking Dr. Murphy.